Zabita had no memory of her parents' faces, only the fire that had swallowed their home like a greedy mouth, smoke rising like a black pillar into the sky. She remembered the crackling of wood, the scream of her mother muffled under the weight of collapsing beams, and the heat that kissed her heels as she ran barefoot across the burning compound. The flames had danced behind her like spirits chasing the last breath of her old life. When the fire finally died, the village elders found her crouched under a palm leaf shelter built by a kind fisherman. She didn't cry. Not once. The silence in her eyes spoke of something scorched deeper than skin. At only 8 years old, she was pronounced an orphan and handed over to distant relatives in the neighboring village of Kulani, people her parents had once helped during a famine. The elders believed this was mercy. But mercy does not always wear kind hands. The compound she was brought to smelled of perfume and ripe bananas. It belonged to Chief Bakuru's second wife, Sidi, and her 2 daughters, Khadija and Malaika. Though they wore fine beads and wrapped their hair in golden cloths, they greeted Zabita as if she were a cursed goat. No smile. No embrace. Just a single sharp look from Sidi before she called out to the maid, "Take her to the back. Let her sleep where the goats do." The back of the compound was nothing more than a roofless shed made from broken cane mats. The ground was hard with dried dung and scattered chicken feathers. That night, Zabita curled against a low wall, clutching her ragged wrap, shivering despite the heat. A goat licked her foot as if in pity. At dawn, the maid pulled her up by the elbow. "Come, filthy one. The madam says you must earn your stay." Zabita began her days before the first rooster crowed. She swept the courtyard, scrubbed the clay pots, fetched water from the farthest well, and polished Sidi's sandals until her small fingers bled. Her reward was not food, but the scraping of other people's meals, cold porridge hardened like stone, fish bones already sucked dry, bits of fruit with teeth marks. But even those were not handed to her. Sidi made her eat from the dustbin, the large clay drum behind the compound where food waste, ash, and sometimes rat droppings collected. If Zabita hesitated, Sidi's eldest daughter would push her head into the bin and laugh. "If dogs can eat from there, why not you?" No one stopped them. Not the guards. Not the neighbors. Not even the maid, who looked away with a face carved from guilt and fear. Every day, Zabita's ribs pushed tighter against her skin. Her eyes sank into shadows. Her hair matted from dirt and sweat became home to lice. But she said nothing. She did not complain. She endured. For she knew, somewhere deep inside, that even fire could not kill her. And if it could not, then neither could humiliation. In the evenings, while others rested or laughed over roasted plantains, Zabita taught herself to cook. She watched from corners, memorizing the hand movements of the maid, how she balanced spices on her palm, how she stirred millet with grace. When the maid once left a pot half filled with stew unattended, Zabita added crushed dried pepper leaves from the garden. When Sidi tasted it and praised the unexpected boldness, the maid took credit, but Zabita smiled to herself in the shadows. She began experimenting in secret, using discarded herbs, wilted vegetables, fish heads. Her fingers learned how to slice without a knife, how to grind with stones, how to flavor bitterness into beauty. She cooked for herself in the night, feeding the goats with half and eating the rest while sitting on a cracked stool. Despite the cruelty, Zabita developed an unusual calm. She began to speak to herself, not in madness but in promise. "You will not break, Zabita. Even stones can bloom with moss if they wait long enough." Time moved like mud. Days into weeks. Weeks into months. Seasons turned. The village came alive with talk of Queen Naya's visit. The young queen, known for her love of traditional dishes and her distaste for empty flattery, was to pass through Kulani on her tour of unity. Every household was instructed to present a delicacy. Sidi, determined to outshine the village, announced she would present a stew so rich the queen would weep. But the maid who knew how to cook had fallen ill. Her hands swollen. Her mouth blistered. Whispers claimed it was a curse for letting a child eat from the dustbin. Sidi panicked. She had no skill in the kitchen, only pride in her pearls. That evening, while Sidi paced and cursed, Zabita stepped forward. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I can cook." The laughter that followed was loud enough to scare birds from the compound trees. Sidi's youngest daughter laughed until she wheezed. "You? Cook for a queen? You belong in a bin." But Sidi paused. Desperation flickered behind her cruel gaze. "If you ruin it," she warned, "you will eat coals." Zabita nodded. "Then I better not ruin it." At dawn, she was given access to the storeroom. The first time she'd seen shelves lined with ginger, turmeric, smoked meat, rare oils. Her hands trembled. Not from fear but from memory. The smells awakened something in her. Her mother's arms stirring a pot. Her father tasting and nodding. The fire of her old home hadn't burned it all. Something still lived. She worked in silence. She cooked as if she were casting spells. Herbs danced. Heat whispered. The pot shimmered like a drum filled with sun. She added her secret ingredients: tamarind rind from the garden, powdered goat hoof for depth, and a dusting of charcoal ash, which gave it an earthiness like rain-soaked soil. The stew simmered for hours. When the queen arrived, robed in red silk and flanked by spearmen, the villagers bowed. Dishes from all houses were presented: yam pies, roasted pigeon, honeyed beans. The queen nodded politely at each. Then came Sidi with her silver bowl. She knelt and presented it. "A humble stew, your grace." The queen lifted a spoon. Blew gently. Tasted. Silence. She tasted again. And again. Then she looked up. Her eyes did not find Sidi's. They searched the crowd and stopped on Zebida, still standing behind the goats, her dress torn, her feet bare, her face calm. "Who cooked this?" the queen asked. Sidi smiled. "My maid." "She." "No," the queen interrupted. She pointed directly at Zebida. "That girl. I know the hands of someone who has survived hunger. This stew tastes of loss and courage and earth." Sidi paled. "Come forward, child," the queen said. Zebida stepped forward. Not with fear. Not with pride. Just quiet strength. "What is your name?" "Zebida." "Well, Zebida, if you ever tire of sleeping with goats, my palace kitchen could use your fire." And just like that, the girl in rags took her first step toward a throne made not of gold, but of fire, flavor, and forgotten names that refused to be silenced. Zebida heard the announcement the way the wind carries news across forgotten fields, soft but undeniable. The village crier stood on a carved stone at the market square, flanked by drummers and dancers, his voice high and proud as he read from the queen's scroll. The parchment shimmered like sunlight on water, stamped with the royal seal. A feast was coming, and not just any feast. The queen's feast where one lucky villager's dish would be chosen to grace the royal palace and earn the cook an honored place among the palace chefs. The news sent waves of excitement through the village. Merchants began selling rare spices at inflated prices. Farmers hoarded their best produce. Women whispered secrets to one another behind pots of bubbling stew, sharing family recipes that had once been spoken only between generations. Even children began to dream aloud of becoming royal chefs. The dusty air smelled richer, warmer, and full of possibility. Zebida watched all of it from behind the hut, where she was swatting flies away from a bucket of goat dung she'd been forced to scrub. Her clothes were stiff with old dirt. Her hair had not been combed in weeks. No one thought to tell her the news directly. But she listened. She always listened. Even when they thought her too broken or too hungry to notice. That night, as the household prepared their own dish for the contest, spiced lamb on steamed millet, Zebida was forbidden from touching anything. "You'll curse it with your filth," her cousin barked, shoving her away from the water basin. She was made to scrub the latrine instead and then fed a plate of half-eaten scraps scraped from others' bowls. But something about the feast stirred a hunger in her that had nothing to do with food. She remembered her mother's hands, strong and dark, always smelling of roasted baobab nuts and crushed tamarind. Her mother used to hum while stirring pots, whispering to the spices as if they were old friends. Zebida closed her eyes and tried to remember the rhythm. She could almost hear it. Her stomach growled, but so did her spirit. She snuck out to the market at dawn 2 days before the feast. With nothing but a strip of cloth tied around her waist and a handful of pebbles to trade, she scoured the edges of the stalls. The vendors ignored her or chased her off. She didn't blame them. She didn't look like someone who had anything of value. But one old woman, hunched beneath a canopy of woven mats, beckoned her over. "You want to cook for the queen, little goat girl?" the woman cackled. Zebida didn't answer. She just looked the woman in the eyes and nodded once. Something in the woman's laughter shifted from mocking to curious. "Then take this," she said, handing over a handful of dried leaves wrapped in palm bark. "Use it only when the pot sings." Zebida didn't ask what the leaves were. She just bowed and whispered thanks. She waited until the eve of the feast. The household had left for the temple, praying for victory. She was alone. She crept into the back shed, where the broken clay pots and rusty pans were dumped. There she built a small fire. She fetched rainwater from the cracked barrel. From the leftovers of leftovers, she gathered her ingredients: rotten plantains, a bruised yam, wild herbs she'd secretly picked behind the goat pen. She worked in silence, but her hands moved with memory. She mashed, stirred, folded, and whispered to the pot just as her mother used to. When the pot began to bubble in a strange rhythm, high, low, then high again, she remembered the old woman's warning. That was the sign. She unwrapped the palm bark and let the dry leaves fall in. A scent erupted, earthy and warm like rain on dry soil, like the smell of stories told under stars. The whole shed glowed, though there were no lanterns. She didn't stop to question it. At dawn, she poured the stew into a small gourd bowl and wrapped it in banana leaves. She waited behind the crowds as villagers presented their gleaming trays of meats, pastries, puddings, and stews. Some had even decorated their dishes with flower petals and gold-dusted fruits. Zebida clutched her humble bundle with shaking hands. The queen arrived in a golden litter, surrounded by guards and dancers. She was radiant, her eyes sharp, her voice calm and curious. She tasted each dish, offering nods or pursing her lips in polite refusal. When Zebida finally stepped forward, the crowd parted not out of respect but out of disgust. Someone sneered, "She brought trash and leaves." Zebida said nothing. She simply knelt and offered the bowl. The queen peered down. Something flickered in her eyes, not pity but interest. She unwrapped the banana leaves, revealing the modest bowl inside. Steam rose. The queen leaned forward, inhaled, and froze. Without a word, she dipped her fingers in and took a bite. Silence fell. Then the queen took another. And another. Her eyes glistened. Her guard stiffened, unsure whether this was joy or something darker. The queen stood. "Who made this?" she asked, though she already knew. Zebida trembled. "I did, your majesty." The queen bent down, her voice softer now. "What is your name?" "Zebida." The queen turned to her officials. "Send for my royal cooks. And prepare a seat at the palace." Murmurs turned to roars. People stared in disbelief. Zebida didn't move. Not until the queen extended her hand. She took it. That day, the girl who had eaten from the dustbin served the queen a meal the court would never forget. One made not from gold, but from memory, defiance, and magic stirred in a broken pot. Zebida stood by the cooking fires, her fingers twitching with longing as the scent of spiced stew curled into her nose. Her cousins stirred pots with laughter in their throats and oil on their cheeks, elbowing one another as they added fresh meat and thick cream into bubbling broths. She reached for a gourd of salt, hoping to help just this once, but a sharp slap met her wrist. "Go back to the waste pit," hissed her aunt, not even glancing at her. "You'll ruin our chances." The others laughed. They always laughed when she was scolded. Even when she bled. Ashamed, Zebida stepped back, cradling her wrist. It was already raw from previous chores. The fire in her belly wasn't just hunger, it was humiliation. She had not eaten anything proper in 2 days. Not since she'd been caught trying to lick porridge from an empty bowl and was sent out to sleep with the goats. Behind her, the family buzzed about the queen's feast. Word had reached their village that the queen herself would travel through the region and honor the most exquisite meal made by common hands. The winner would be invited to cook at the palace kitchens for a whole moon cycle. The family had gone mad with excitement. They'd slaughtered a goat, ground spices finer than dust, and borrowed silver pots from a neighbor. But none of that belonged to her. Zebida, in her rags and bare feet, was not family. Not in their eyes. She walked slowly to the back of the compound where burnt yams, cracked shells, and fish bones piled high. She crouched, picking through the mess. A blackened plantain caught her eye. She turned it over. The edges were charred, but the inside, still soft if bitter, could perhaps be salvaged. Each time she reached into the pile, her stomach turned, but she forced herself not to gag. She found a few soggy beans, a spoiled tomato with one side unbruised, and a dried pepper so thin it rattled. These she placed carefully in the old calabash she'd hidden near the fence. It was cracked along the edge and had once held goat feed. She had washed it with river water and left it to dry under the sun, her own secret. The calabash now rested under an acacia tree at the edge of the field, away from the eyes that watched and mocked. It was her altar of shame. And perhaps, her altar of hope. When night fell and the others feasted on bits they wouldn't dare share with her, Zebida slipped away with her calabash, walking to the riverbank where moonlight turned everything silver. She sat on a flat stone and began sorting the scraps, slicing away rot with a sliver of bone she had sharpened days before. Her hands moved slowly, reverently, as though preparing sacred offerings. A dash of ash from the fire pit went in, just enough to thicken the watery mix. She crushed the soggy beans with her fingers, blending them with a bit of stale oil she had stolen from under a table. A few grains of salt she had found in the dirt. The tomato pulp was squeezed, the black plantain mashed in, and finally the dried pepper, broken into tiny flakes, was stirred in with trembling fingers. It looked like nothing. It smelled like smoke and sorrow. But it was hers. She placed the lid gently on top, tying it shut with a frayed thread from her tunic. Then she buried it beneath loose soil by the tree, marking the spot with 3 stones shaped like teardrops. She sat there for a long while, her knees pulled to her chest, whispering the names of her parents to the stars. She asked them to guide her hands, to turn shame into something sacred. The next day the compound was filled with noise and movement. Everyone was scrubbing, garnishing, preparing. The smell of roasted meat floated down every alleyway. Zabita was ordered to clean the floors, fetch water, and sweep ashes, all while hunger gnawed her ribs. When no one was looking, she tiptoed to the field. Her heart pounded in her throat as she dug up the calabash. The thread had held. She checked inside. The paste had darkened slightly, it scent more pungent now, but she dared not taste it. She hadn't eaten anything in nearly 3 days, but she was afraid to ruin what little she had crafted. She wrapped the calabash in old cloth and hid it in her tunic. Later that afternoon, villagers gathered at the square, their dishes spread on palm mats or carried in decorative gourds and bronze platters. Laughter echoed. Children danced. Drums beat softly. Zabita kept to the edge, holding the calabash close. When the queen's heralds arrived, the air changed. Horses with gold tassels and horned guards in shining robes parted the crowd. A woman in blue silk stepped forward, tall, serene, with eyes like storm clouds. Queen Amina. Her presence was quiet but heavy, like rain about to fall. Each family presented their food, and the queen tasted only a spoonful before nodding or moving on. Applause followed. Compliments poured. But with each step she took, her face remained unreadable. Zabita watched from the back, trembling. Her relatives had already presented their dish, a creamy meat stew in a silver bowl, and now stood preening under the praise of a palace taster. Zabita took 1 step forward. Then another. The queen turned slightly, sensing her presence. A guard stepped forward, but the queen lifted a hand. "What is your name, child?" "Zabita," she said, her voice barely audible. The queen tilted her head. "And what have you brought?" Zabita held out the calabash. The cloth was stained, the gourd worn. The crowd snickered. "It is ash paste," she whispered. "Made from what was thrown away." The crowd roared with laughter now. But the queen did not smile. She reached out slowly and untied the thread. The smell drifted upward, smoke, rot, and something earthy. Something human. She dipped 1 finger in and tasted. The silence was instant. The queen closed her eyes. Then tasted again. Gasps rippled. The guards glanced at each other. She did not speak at first. Instead, she lifted the calabash and turned to her attendants. "This," she said, her voice low but clear, "tells a truth no spice can cover. It tastes of hunger and memory, of sorrow made sacred, of fire survived." Zabita felt her knees give. She was shaking. She expected ridicule. A slap. But not this. Queen Amina looked at her. "Did you cook this alone?" Zabita nodded. "From the waste pit. At night. By the river." The queen stepped closer. "Then you, little one, have cooked what no royal ever has, truth." Her cousin stood frozen. Her aunt's mouth was open. The entire square seemed to sway. The queen turned to her herald. "Send word to the palace. A new cook comes with us tonight." Zabita fell to her knees, the calabash clutched to her chest like a newborn. She would not forget the waste, the rot, the ash. But neither would the queen. And in that moment, as the sky turned orange with dusk, the village that had spat her name now whispered it with wonder. Zabita. From the dustbin she had risen. And what she served was not just food, it was soul. Zabita sat by the river's edge, her thin arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes red from weeping. The calabash she had hidden beside her rested quietly in the sand, the burnt bits and rotting scraps sealed within. The scent had started to rise, a mixture of charred wood, spoiled yam, and bitter onion skins. Her stomach growled, but her mouth remained shut, as if even hunger was afraid to open itself in this silence. The wind was gentle but constant, whispering over the water, threading through the reeds, tugging softly at her tattered dress. Zabita didn't look up when she heard the squelch of footsteps in the wet earth. People rarely came to this part of the river. It was known to be strange, too still, too dark. She assumed it was another cousin sent to drag her back and slap her for being slow. But when the voice came, it wasn't cruel. It was old, crackling like dry leaves and sweet palm wine. "You cry into the river as if it can carry your tears away," the voice said. Zabita turned her head slowly. Standing there was a woman who looked like she belonged to the earth itself. Her skin was a deep bark brown, folded in places like river stone, and her eyes were cloudy, pale, but sharp in focus. She wore a wrapper of mossy green, a headscarf twisted with dried vines and pepper leaves, and her feet were bare and cracked like dry land. Zebeda stood quickly, wiping her face. I was only resting, Ma." The old woman chuckled softly. "Resting with pain so loud even the water stirred?" Zebeda blinked, confused. The woman stepped closer and crouched by the calabash. She sniffed the air, nodded, then sat fully on the ground. "Come," she said, patting the earth beside her. "Tell me why you cook with sorrow." Zebeda hesitated. She didn't know why she obeyed, but she sat. Maybe because the woman had used the word cook. Maybe because she hadn't flinched at the smell. Maybe because her presence felt like a whisper from the ancestors. "I wasn't trying to cook," Zebeda said. "They told me to throw these things out. I was only—" She stopped, ashamed. "You kept them," the old woman said. "You didn't throw them away." Zebeda looked at the basket. "I didn't mean to. But you did." The woman placed a hand on Zebeda's shoulder. It was warm, dry, comforting. "There is something they do not know. Food born from pain feeds more than hunger." Zebeda didn't understand, not fully. But she listened. The woman stood again and reached into the river, her hand gliding through the surface like silk. When she pulled it out, a faint shimmer of water clung to her fingers. She touched the calabash gently, and the stench lifted like steam, replaced by a subtle, earthy scent, bitter but rich. "You see," the woman said, "flavor does not come from fine ingredients. It comes from story. And your story, it has many spices." Zebeda tilted her head. "But, it's just rot." "Rot is a kind of transformation," the woman said. "Ferment it. Boil the bitterness with memory. Add sorrow like you'd add salt. Then listen. Listen. To the river." Zebeda tried. The old woman closed her eyes and Zebeda followed, letting the sounds guide her. The water trickled and rippled. Then it shifted. In her mind, Zebeda began to hear not just water but voices, memories rising like steam from a pot. Her mother's laughter, brief like sunlight breaking clouds. Her father's humming as he stirred the village porridge. The sound of rain on the old clay roof. The sudden silence the day the fire swallowed her home. The screaming. The crackle of embers. And then, her first night with her cousins, curled near the goats, eating crusted pap from a bucket. Zebeda trembled. The old woman placed a finger under her chin. "You remember? That is enough." The old woman pulled from her own wrap a small pouch. From it she sprinkled something powdery into Zebeda's calabash, ground baobab, perhaps, or something older. The river stirred. "You must finish it," the woman said. "But not as they told you. You will cook it not with fire but with feeling. Let your hands knead the memory. Let the shame be stirred away. Let the anger boil. Let the hope simmer." Zebeda opened the calabash. The scraps had changed. They were no longer spoiled, at least not in the same way. They smelled strange, yes, but there was complexity. A sweetness hidden under sourness. A richness under decay. She looked up, but the woman was gone. The river had swallowed her, or perhaps she had never truly been there. Zebeda stared at the water, then at her hands, then at the mixture before her. She began to work. Her fingers, though raw and rough, moved as if they remembered a recipe she'd never been taught but always known. She mashed and stirred, ground leaves she'd gathered, squeezed juice from bitter nuts, and folded everything into a clay pot she'd kept hidden for weeks. The sun rose higher, but she did not tire. It was as if the river itself gave her strength. As the mixture bubbled, Zebeda began to hum. She didn't know the song. But the river did. And it hummed with her. By dusk, she had something that looked like nothing the village had ever cooked. The color was dark, too dark for stew, too rich for ash. The scent was haunting. Like wood smoke and forgotten lullabies. Like grief after mourning. Like hunger after healing. She wrapped the pot in leaves and carried it back to the compound. No one noticed her return. They were busy preparing their own dishes, fine meats and jollof, dried fish soaked in pepper stew, fried plantains sugared to perfection. Zebeda placed her own bundle behind a basket. She would offer it. Not for the crown. Not to win. But because the river had whispered her worth. Because food born of pain was not a curse. It was her truth. And maybe, just maybe, it could still be served. Zebeda stood barefoot in the shadows of her relative's kitchen hut, the sting of fresh bruises rising on her arm where her aunt had struck her with a ladle. Her ears still rang with the harsh laughter of her cousins as they tossed perfectly good millet into the fire just to watch her scramble for the scraps. She had grown used to the taste of soot, used to the ache in her stomach that tightened with each sunset. But she had not grown used to the shame. That morning, after her aunt ordered her to sweep the compound and clean the soot from the cooking stones, Zebita had slipped quietly toward the back, where the forest line met the garden. There, hidden behind thick cassava leaves and broken clay pots, rested her calabash, the one she'd been secretly filling since the old woman at the river gave her that strange lesson. The meal she would make had no name. It was not written in any book or spoken aloud in market stalls. It was built from memory, sorrow, and what others called waste. Every time she had been beaten, every time she had eaten from the dirt, every time she had been called a rat or a beggar, she had poured that pain into the calabash. With each discarded root or onion skin, each ash-covered bone she found near the pit, she layered flavor. Not just of the tongue but of the soul. She started with a thick paste made from charred maize husks ground with river salt. It smelled of earth and smoke. To this she added water she had fetched at dawn, gathered from a spot just beneath where the old woman had once stood barefoot on a stone. That water, she believed, still held her whisper. Then came the roots. She mashed them with her fists, adding a bitter leaf that her aunt thought poisonous, though the old woman had said, "Boiled long enough, bitterness turns sweet." Into the fire went the pot, but she used her own little hearth, one she built behind the goat pen. The goats bleated softly as if understanding the secret she was weaving. She stirred as the mixture thickened, its fragrance curling upward like old lullabies sung in forgotten tongues. It didn't smell like stew or porridge. It smelled like longing. Like shame that had been cleaned and offered back as something beautiful. She added a final handful of crushed hibiscus petals, not for color, but because it reminded her of her mother's scarf, the one she lost in the fire. As evening fell, the village buzzed with excitement. Dishes of honeyed yam, roasted fowl, and spiced dates were being carried on woven trays toward the central square. Drums echoed in the distance. Children ran in excitement, their faces dusted with flour. The queen had arrived. Zebita did not expect to be noticed. Her relatives laughed when she emerged from behind the hut carrying her calabash wrapped in old cloth. "Are you serving ghost food, rat girl?" her cousin jeered. "You'll poison the queen." Still, Zebita walked to the square. Her steps were quiet, but her heart beat like thunder. No one saw her place her calabash among the many silver trays. She did not stand beside it. She left it there and slipped away, hiding behind a tree wrapped in shadow. The queen sat beneath a silk canopy, guarded by spearmen in robes of indigo and gold. She was young, but her eyes were old, tired from battles no one dared speak of. She tasted each dish brought before her with the grace of someone used to false sweetness. She smiled politely, praised the textures, nodded at the seasoning. But her eyes remained far away. Then her hand paused over the calabash. Unlike the others, it had no gold lining, no decorative carvings. Just wood and cloth and something strange curling out of it, a smell unlike any the queen had known. She motioned for it to be brought closer. "What is this?" she asked. The servant shook his head. "No one claims it, my queen." But the queen lifted the lid. Steam, dark and fragrant, rose like incense from old temples. She dipped her fingers in and tasted it. For a moment her spine stiffened. Her eyes fluttered shut. And then, she wept. The square fell silent. She stood. "Who cooked this?" No one answered. Whispers spread. People looked around. Zebita held her breath behind the tree. "This dish," the queen said, voice trembling, "tastes like every time I was told I wasn't enough. Every night I cried into pillows I wasn't allowed to own. Every moment I had to pretend that crowns aren't made of iron and silence." Her hands shook. "Who made this?" Zebita stepped forward. She did not speak. She merely bowed, her rags trailing behind her like faded honor. The queen stepped down from her canopy, approaching the girl slowly. The crowd held its breath. Zebita didn't know if she would be scolded or struck or dragged away for daring to touch the sacred table. Instead, the queen reached out and cupped her chin. "You," she said softly, "have fed more than hunger today." Zebita's eyes filled. No one had ever touched her with such tenderness. Not since her mother. "What is it called?" the queen asked. Zebita hesitated. Then whispered, "It carries everything they threw away." The queen turned to the people. "Then remember this. Sometimes the most powerful dishes are made not from what we gather, but what we discard." She lifted Zebita's hand and raised it high. The crowd erupted, not with applause but with reverent silence. A hush of understanding that some meals came from suffering, and in tasting them, we were reminded of who we once were, and who we could still become. That night, Zebita was invited to the palace. She didn't ride in a golden chariot or walk on rose petals. She carried her calabash herself. When she reached the palace kitchens, the royal chef stepped aside. The queen had given her a place, not just at the table but in the legacy of the land. And from that day on, once every moon, a strange, smoky dish was served to the court. One that smelled of sorrow, tasted like strength, and reminded everyone that even from the dustbin, something divine could rise. The sun hovered above the village square like a watchful eye as the queen's entourage arrived, golden banners fluttering against the wind. Drummers beat slowly, each thud echoing like a heartbeat through the tense crowd. Every family stood behind their table, their best dishes displayed with pride: bowls of steaming yam porridge, roasted goat glazed with palm oil, fish wrapped in banana leaves and smoked to perfection. The smell of spices and celebration floated in the air like a song of longing. But in the farthest corner of the square, nearly hidden by a crooked stand, stood Zebita. Her dish, dark and modest in a wooden calabash, looked nothing like the others. It bore no decoration, no garnish, no gold-trimmed cloth. Only the aroma rose, strange, deep, and unfamiliar, like the scent of old earth after rain, sorrow mingled with memory. She stood barefoot, her dress still patched and her hands trembling. People snickered behind their hands. She brought ash to the queen, one villager scoffed. Another muttered, "That's what happens when you sleep near goats, your sense leaves you." Zebita didn't flinch. She only clutched the calabash tighter, remembering the river's whisper, the old woman's eyes, and the strange herbs that now lived inside the meal. She waited. The queen, a tall woman with silver beads woven into her hair and the calm of centuries in her gaze, walked slowly from table to table. She tasted each dish with deliberate care. Her chief taster, her advisors, and even her guard followed, commenting, nodding, occasionally smiling. Each cook held their breath as the queen brought food to her lips. She praised the yam porridge with a nod. She smiled at the roasted goat. She lifted her eyebrows at the smoked fish. But no tears, no surprise. Just grace. Then she reached Zebita's corner. At first she walked past, distracted by a stall with carved sweets. But then she stopped mid-step. Her head turned slightly, nostrils flaring, eyes narrowing. The smell had found her. She looked back. Her guard followed her gaze and frowned. "That's not on the list, Majesty," he said quietly. The queen ignored him. She stepped toward Zebita. "What is this?" the queen asked, voice low, eyes fixed on the calabash. Zebita lowered her gaze. "It's called Okuno Waimoyo, my queen. The dish of the heart's remains." A ripple passed through the crowd. A few laughed, a few gasped. But the queen reached forward and lifted the lid. The scent bloomed like a secret garden. Beneath the layers of ash-dusted roots and fermented herbs was something old and powerful, something not born of recipe but of survival. The queen dipped a wooden spoon into the dish and tasted. The world seemed to hold its breath. She froze. Her lips pressed together. Her eyes glistened. She swallowed slowly. Then she raised one hand. "Silence," she said. And silence fell like a stone. The villagers stared. Even the birds seemed to quiet. The queen placed the spoon down, gently, reverently. She turned to her advisors. "None of you told me," she whispered. They looked confused. "Told you what, Majesty?" She turned back to Zebita. "Who taught you this?" she asked. Zebita opened her mouth, then hesitated. She remembered the woman's voice by the river. "Say nothing of me, child. My work is done when yours begins." I made it alone," Zebita said softly. The queen studied her for a long moment. Then she stepped closer. "This tastes like the prayers of someone forgotten. Like grief that still wants to give. Like hunger that survived itself." Zebita's hands began to shake. Her knees buckled slightly, but she held herself steady. "You made this from pain," the queen said. "I made it because no one else would feed me," Zebita replied. "So I learned to feed myself." The queen's eyes did not leave hers. "And now you fed me." The silence deepened. Then the queen turned to the crowd. "This is the dish I choose," she said. Shouts erupted, some in confusion, others in outrage. "But she's nobody. She used waste. That's not a feast, it's sorrow." But the queen raised her hand again. "You fed me luxury," she told the villagers, "but she fed me truth." She looked back at Zebita. "What is your name, child?" "Zebita, my queen." "Well, Zebita, you are no longer invisible. Prepare yourself. Tomorrow you cook in the royal palace. Gasps shot through the square like sparks. Zabita's heart pounded. Her lips trembled. "But I have nothing," she whispered. "Not even shoes." "You have everything," the queen replied. "You have the story of every woman who was ever forgotten. That is more than gold." She gestured to her guard. "See that she is clothed, fed, and given shelter." Zabita held the calabash close as the guard led her away, tears finally spilling from her eyes. Behind her, the queen still stood, one hand resting on her chest, where her heart beat loudly and the taste of the forgotten still lingered on her tongue. Zabita stood small but steady before the queen, her hands trembling but her voice calm. The silence in the gathering was heavy, broken only by the queen's steady breaths and the clink of her spoon returning to the bowl. The queen sat in quiet contemplation for a moment longer, her face unreadable. But something stirred behind her eyes, something deeper than surprise, more personal than admiration. She leaned forward, her voice low and deliberate. "Who cooked this?" she asked. Zabita stepped forward. "I did, Your Majesty." Murmurs rolled through the courtyard like a sudden gust of wind. All heads turned to the girl in rags, the one who had always been ignored, kicked, or overlooked. But Zabita did not bow. Her eyes remained on the queen, not out of defiance but out of something older, an ancient ache that mirrored the weight behind the queen's question. "What is it made from?" the queen asked. Zabita hesitated, then took a slow breath. "Scraps," she began. "Burnt rice, spoiled roots, meat thrown away. And memory." "Memory?" the queen repeated. "Yes, my queen. The memory of hunger. Of wanting to taste what others eat but being given what even dogs refuse. The memory of standing in smoke while others sat in laughter. Of hiding in corners so no one saw you cry." The queen's face softened and her hand moved slowly to touch her own necklace, an old carved pendant that didn't match her royal attire. She looked down at the dish once more. "I've tasted many things," she said softly. "Spices from kingdoms far away, meats aged in the caves of the highlands, fruits that bloom once every 10 years. But nothing has struck my tongue quite like this." Her voice caught. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and when she spoke again, it was not as a queen but as someone unmasked. "I know this taste," she whispered. "When I was a child, I lived in a hut where hunger was a song we sang to sleep. My mother made a broth from ash and bark when nothing else remained. She said it would give the spirit strength to wait for better days. That taste, this taste, it brings her back to me." A deep hush fell again. Zabita blinked, stunned. She hadn't known the queen's story. No one had. "I did not cook it for a crown," Zabita said. "Only because I was told food born from pain feeds more than hunger." The queen nodded slowly. "Who told you that?" Zabita thought of the old woman at the river, her skin like tree bark, her voice like rain on dry leaves. "I don't know her name. She just appeared." The queen smiled faintly as if she recognized something. "There are women who walk between the seen and unseen," she said. "They show up when the land forgets its daughters." The queen rose from her seat. Without waiting for the royal announcer or guards, she walked to Zabita. The hem of her gown brushed the dust, but she did not care. Standing before the orphan girl, the queen reached out and took Zabita's soot-stained hand. "Today you reminded a kingdom what truth tastes like." Zabita's mouth trembled. For the first time in years, her tears weren't of pain but of being seen. The queen turned to the crowd. "Let it be known, this dish shall be remembered not for its elegance but for the courage it carried." People bowed their heads. Even those who had once mocked or ignored Zabita dared not look her in the eye. Something had shifted, like the tide of a river finding its way back home. The taste of truth lingered on every tongue, and from that moment forward, so did the name Zabita. The queen stood tall amidst the crowd, her jeweled robes catching the afternoon light. The village square had fallen into complete silence after Zabita's words. Her story had cracked something in the air, like a hidden shell broken open for all to see the soft truth inside. The nobles shifted uncomfortably. The villagers looked down, ashamed. The queen, however, kept her gaze fixed on Zabita, who stood trembling beside her humble clay bowl. "Step forward," the queen said, voice calm but firm. Zabita hesitated. Her legs felt weak, but her soul, strengthened by years of swallowing tears and dust, moved her feet. She took a single step, then another, until she stood before the monarch. The queen turned to the crowd. "This child," she began, raising a hand toward Zabita, "has served me something more powerful than any roast lamb or sugared yam. She served truth, sorrow, memory, seasoned with courage." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Zabita's relatives stood in the back, frozen, their faces tight with panic and shame. The queen pointed directly at them. Bring them forward. The guards moved quickly. Zebida's aunt and uncle were pushed into the open, their eyes darting, seeking escape but finding none. The queen looked at them, her voice turning sharper than the edge of a ceremonial blade. You took in an orphan not with love but with contempt. You fed her rot while you feasted. You beat her hands when she reached for warmth, and you made her sleep beside animals as if she were one. The aunt's lips quivered. Your Majesty, we had so little. You had enough to dress yourselves, the queen interrupted. Enough to prepare fine meals for this feast, but not enough to share with a girl who had no one? Shame is too kind a word for what you deserve. The crowd murmured. Some began to cry softly. Others lowered their eyes, knowing they had turned blind when they should have intervened. The queen then turned back to Zebida. Tell me something, child. What did you call this dish? Zebida, her voice barely more than a whisper, replied, I didn't name it. I only made it. The queen nodded. Then I shall name it for you. I call it the truth beneath ash. And from this day forward, this dish shall be served in the palace on the eve of every harvest festival, to remind us all that beauty can rise from the bitterest suffering. The air thickened with awe. The queen bent slightly and touched Zebida's cheek. You will come with me to the royal palace. From this day, you are no longer a shadow in someone's corner. You are to be trained in the royal kitchens as a royal apprentice. Zebida's eyes widened. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her tunic. Me? In the palace? Yes, the queen said. Because those who know hunger, true hunger, cook with the deepest heart. And your heart, Zebida, is one this kingdom will learn from. Tears spilled down Zebida's cheeks. For the first time in years, they were not from pain or fear, but from something warm and golden blooming inside her chest. The queen raised her voice again. Let this day be remembered. Let it be written in our histories, that a girl once forced to eat from the dustbin served a dish that shook the throne. Let her name echo louder than those who tried to bury it. The people clapped, slowly at first, then louder, until the village square rang with the sound of redemption. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the land, Zebida stepped beside the queen, her bare feet no longer stepping through dust but toward destiny.